Well, welcome, Philip. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Peter. Thanks for having me.
And so for the rest of us that didn't go to seminary with you, give us kind of Philip Miller in a snapshot. Who are you?
Oh, yeah. So I'm Philip Miller. I've been pastor at Moody Church here for 4 going on 5 years. Before that, I was a senior pastor for 7 years in Washington State, which is the northwest corner of the United States. Before that, an associate pastor. And then I got my training. I'm kind of going backwards here. I got my training at Dallas Theological Seminary. And then before that, Cedarville University, which you probably never heard of, but that's in Ohio. It's near where I grew up. And so I'm from a family that, followed Jesus and went to church. And I kind of grew up, familiar with faith, but had kind of a moralistic religious sort of orientation to God. I figured if I was really, really good, he'd love me. And of course, that's not the gospel. And so it took a while for me to actually understand the gospel. I was around it my whole life. And I got lots of the scriptures in my life, but it took a while until I really experienced grace. And so in my early teen years, I started sinning like for real. And I realized I was angry and I was lustful and I was deeply broken. And which is, if you have a moral performance sort of relationship with God, it's very scary to find out that you're not good, because then you feel like you have to hide it and pretend it's not real. And you start disintegrating, you have your projected self and you have your real self, and they're cleaving apart. And so that was the moment for me when I finally realized. I still remember I was at church and this mom said to their kid, and they're probably still in therapy to this day about it, but they said to their kid, like, why can't you be more like Philip? And I was like, you have no idea what you're saying. What you're saying. Like, I'm a mess. And the Lord used that disintegration to help me understand the gospel. And so I finally brought my brokenness to the Lord and I said, help, I'm a mess. I need you to save me, not from a bunch of sins I do, but from who I am. I'm the problem here. And for the first time in my life, I was so deeply broken and deeply marred and sinful, and yet knew that I was loved in Jesus Christ. And that blew my mind. And so that grace was my moment. And then God used that to kind of draw out a sense of calling toward pastoral ministry that I resisted for a long time because I thought it would be miserable. But he wore me down, God has a way of getting his way, in the end, and he got his man. And so I finally yielded. And so anyway, that's kind of a little bit of my background.
That's great.
And so I love preaching now, even though I dreaded it for a long time. And so it's a joy.
Question on what you're saying there. Obviously, there's that moment where you kind of realized you're broken and the gospel kind of made sense, that the light kind of came on. Do you feel there's like an ongoing sense of that as well, that God brings you back to that sense of brokenness and humility?
Yes, and it kind of morphs a little bit. When I was really young, it was sort of like, be good and God will love you. And then the gospel had to undo that narrative. And I had to realize I was loved for Jesus' sake, not my own. And, but then I went off to seminary and I became a pastor, and I was, giving my life to the service of the Lord. And so my pride rose again and started identifying all these good things I'm doing for God in service of God, and started taking pride in those things. And so even though I understood grace foundationally for my salvation, operationally in my life, I was still looking to my own moral performance or my own service of the Lord. I thought, like, God really loves me. I'm on his team, serving him. I'm giving my life for him. I must be his favorite, and which is really self-righteousness all over again, but in a different mode. And And so the Lord has to like, chip that away and start, reminding me that I'm loved in Jesus Christ, regardless of whether I'm in full-time ministry or not, whether the church is growing or not, or whether, all the indicators, people are happy or whatever, right? That those things. So this reminder of the gospel, like as an operating system for my life, something that I repeatedly have to learn. And I think it's a real danger in ministry when things are going well to start to think, oh, well, this is God's blessing, and that must be because I'm doing something right, and confusing my service for the Lord with my identity in Christ. And those are different things. And the way of the cross is there's a rest to the finished work of Christ. Like he's enough. And every time I move the marker onto my own righteousness, I'm the loser of that arrangement. And because it will betray you. And I think that's a perennial danger in ministry. So
yeah, absolutely. So just to fill out the picture as well, you're married, you have, is it 4 children?
Yes, married, 4 kids. Claire, Violet, Cora, and Jude are my kids. They're 14 down to 8. And Krista is my wife. We've been married 20 years. So we met in college and got married right after college before seminary. And my wife has been on this educational journey. We went to Cedarville together. We went to Dallas Theological Seminary together. She got a Th.M. as well. Stashek knows Krista from our Dallas Seminary days as well. And now we're getting doctorates together. So that's kind of fun. So
excellent. Yeah. So for people that haven't been to Moody Church, it's quite a unique setting, isn't it, as a church? What's that like, and what are some of the challenges that brings for you as a preacher?
Yeah. So Moody Church is kind of a unique church, even in American history. It's as American churches go, it's pretty old. It's 160 some years old. So it was begun by the evangelist D.L. Moody back in 1864. And he started a lot of things. He was involved in the YMCA here in Chicago. He started Moody Church. He started the school, Moody Bible Institute. He actually started 5 schools, I think, a bunch in Northfield, Massachusetts, one in London, actually. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, he was one of these entrepreneurial types that he started a publishing house as well. And so he was a real innovator, but he left all these institutions, and then he died in 1899, and then all these institutions had to kind of figure out what life looks like beyond D.L. Moody. And so there's a heritage there that's really beautiful, but you don't survive 160 years without figuring out your own identity and calling. And I think Moody Church has lived kind of on the edge of like a conservative theology in the U.S. that has really been the bridge between like really strong theology and popular proclamation. And so that kind of evangelistic and the gospel for the everyman kind of approach in American history. So it's been very influential on a very popular average person that doesn't have a lot of theological education, but it's been very grounding through the radio, books, and the ministry. So it's been a kind of a hub of the evangelical world here in the U.S. And as far as like historic pulpits go, you've got your mainline denominations that have those big cathedrals, but in terms of like conservative historic churches, like Moody Church would be kind of in a unique or rarefied category there. So it's a big room with a big heritage and a big reach. But we're right here in the middle of the city of Chicago. And so urban churches, in general struggle. Parking is a problem, transportation is a problem, congestion is a problem. And so it's a big church, but it's not as big as you might think, given some of its reach globally and whatnot.
And it's
But
it's kind of like a hub in the city as well, isn't it? It feels
it
like
is.
people, it's central, but also you've got all these other churches in different directions. And
Yeah.
every, even people who are in other churches are sort of, it feels like they've got this affection for Moody Church because it's in their city.
Yeah.
Kind of Christmas programs or something. It seems like
Yeah.
people will come to Moody even if it's not their church. Is that right?
Yeah, and we get like onlooker traffic, which is a really weird dynamic. But yeah, big programs, Easter, Christmas, that sort of thing. We'll end up with people that are from all over the place, or they kind of like a dual allegiance, right? So coming into the city is a hassle, right? So maybe they're here once a month, but they have another church in their suburb area that they are 3 times out of 4 they're at that one, and then but they like Moody Church, and so they pop in to get a little bit, which is weird and kind of drives me nuts. But you can't fight it. It's such a cultural phenomenon. So you just kind of figure out, all right, how do we work with this and not create problems? But
And as a church as well, it's not, I suppose maybe because it's urban, but it just seems like it's very mixed, isn't it? It's very diverse, a
yeah,
real cross section of society.
yeah. So like London or any major city, you've got just a lot of pluralism. So you've got a lot of mix of nations and people groups and socioeconomic and all of that kind of diversity. And that would be reflected at Moody Church. We have I think we did 10 years ago, we did like a little survey and we found out we had 70 different birth nations represented in our congregation, which is just phenomenal, right? And so I love that about our church. It's like a little taste of heaven. And frankly, I don't know why that's happened. If you go back 70 years and you look at pictures from the church, like they look like me. They're very just white Anglo. And that represented the city at that time where we are located. And the city's gotten a lot of diversity around us, but you kind of go, how did the Lord do that? Take something that was very vanilla and make it into a really beautiful representation of his body. So we just view that as grace. And it's not like we sat down and had a strategic plan. It's just God did it. And we're really grateful. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so you're kind of coming in from a more normal church. I don't want to say anything specific, but just a sort of normal church setting in
Yeah.
Washington
Yep.
State, and then you're dropping into Chicago into this diverse, bizarre, historic kind of pulpit. Has it changed your preaching, or like how have you thought through preaching in that context?
Yes, it has changed my preaching. I I think the things that number one, the room changed my preaching. So this is on a very superficial level. The room is big and it's an old historic sanctuary made out of mainly brick. And so it's a live room. So unlike modern acoustics where it's like it's dead and so you can whisper and everybody hears it, right? Like it's an oratory room. It was designed before PA, systems and audio assistants and screens. So it's designed for projection. And so you can't talk fast. You have to talk loud and you have to be clear and you have to allow margin between your words enough
Hmm.
that you don't muddle in terms of communication. So you slow down a lot in terms of delivery. So that was one very noticeable change stylistically. And then I do think from a diversity standpoint, the people who populate my imagination as I'm preparing to preach, that has just gotten a lot more broad. So you just start to think through, okay, so the single mom who's struggling to pay her rent and working 2 jobs and raising 2 kids by herself, how does the gospel shape her world this week? And then on the other side, how do I speak in such a way that the CEO of a Fortune 500 company who's managing an executive team and a giant balance sheet and is trying to figure out how to steward their wealth for the kingdom of God. Like somehow I've got to communicate to both of those folks, and thinking about like from modern, sort of Western ideology, like there are people from that. And then I've got a whole bunch of people from India, and they're thinking much more communally and family, and like, how do we, so they're dealing with how do I be myself and not disappoint my parents, and over here in the West, I've got this hyper individualized, go be your true self. And I'm trying to teach you how to have community. Right. So, and so even to highlight that. So I'll just say, like, some of you are from very traditional families and you understand this better than we do as Westerners.
Hmm.
You understand when the Bible's talking about community and the importance of an interdependent discipleship, like you intuitively get that better than we do. And we need to learn from you. And so like things like that, like I would never have talked that way a few years ago, but in a setting like this, you do have to think through that kind of stuff. And then in terms of like the historic nature of the church, I like telling stories from our heritage to kind of highlight values that are still who we are and shape what we're doing. So to ground things like this Christmas, we're having our end of year campaign is Hope for Kids, and we're going to be blessing a whole network of ministry partnerships, but all of them are working with kids. And so I can go back and say, D.L. Moody, when he started this church, it actually came out of a Sunday school for kids. And he would get on his pony and he would throw candy at the kids in the street that nobody wanted. They were just a problem, a nuisance. No church wanted them. And he would say, come follow me. And he would teach them English, and he would teach them the gospel, and he would teach them they were loved by Jesus. And he would change their lives, because D.L. Moody believed that kids were worthy of investing in. And we're still doing it today. Right. So it's a way you kind of lead in a historic environment. If you can ground what you're doing in your story and past, it just gives it power. And everyone's like, yeah, that's who we are, And then the other thing I would say, just in terms of shaping communication, is we have a radio ministry. So everything I say gets recycled. So I'm speaking to that room, and then I'm speaking beyond that room. And that just means you have to think through what you're saying differently. So you can't do things that are time bound as much. So you can't say, man, what a beautiful day it is today. Well, because when it's on the radio, it might be rainy. It just doesn't work, right? So you have to think, how do I communicate in an evergreen way that's not tied to too much specific, like we're a church in Chicago, so I'm going to make references to Chicago. That doesn't throw people off. They know they're listening in on something else. But I also don't want to say, man, the Bears got trounced. Yeah, it's our football team. It's the one with the hands, not the feet. Sorry. Football, right. American football. But anyway, if you do anything that's tied too much, or even like the election, we just had an election. If I were to illustrate in my sermon something about the election, it's so time bound.
Mm-hmm.
I can't use it again in 2 years in the same way. And so that shapes my communication significantly as well.
And presumably with such a diverse mixture of people, you have to be extra careful with the sort of political stuff anyway, because in some churches in America, you're pretty safe making political references because 98% would vote the same.
Right.
Where you are, you've got all sides coming in, right?
Right. Yeah, and I actually spend a lot of my pastoral time helping our people remember that there are other people that vote differently than them, that are brothers and sisters and are actually part of your family forever. And so how do you steward your political values and preferences and convictions, right? I mean, it's okay to have convictions politically, but to do it in such a way that you're honoring the fact that you've got brothers and sisters who are going to make different choices than you. And your relationship still needs to be marked by love and devotion to Christ and gospel centrality. And that kingdom mindset has to be stronger than whatever other opinions you're expressing, right? And
Right.
so I spend a lot of my time shepherding in that regard, just toward we're a gospel people, and that's what unifies us.
Hmm.
So,
I mean, in
and
a way, that should be true everywhere, right? But it's going to be
yeah, it should
more of a
be.
feature where you are.
Yeah, it should be. And the other thing I'm aware of, Peter, is that most of I'm in a liberal city, so most of the people I want to reach with the gospel are on the liberal side of the political spectrum. And so, um, so if I have maybe conservative leanings, or some of the leadership or pastors or whatever might have conservative leanings in terms of politics, like that can't be our flag we fly, because I don't want people to reject that. I want to make the cross the point of offense, right?
Hmm.
Let the gospel be the thing we're known for. And it's kind of like a flagpole. You can only really have one great flag on a good flagpole, um, and maybe a small secondary flag, but it's got to be so looming large. It's like that's the flag we fly, and that needs to be Christ and His gospel, and that has to be front and center.
Yeah. What would you say? You've been preaching over multiple years. What have some of the kind of preaching things you've learned, some of the lessons that when you look back 15, 20 years, you think, oh, at that point, I didn't
Mm.
realize, but now, what are some of those things that have kind of shifted over the years?
That's a great question. I think in my early preaching, I right out of seminary, I didn't know my own voice. And so I did a lot of like magpie imitation of people that I admired. And I did that consciously and unconsciously. Like, so sometimes I was like, okay, I'm not sure how to tackle this. So I'm going to go listen to some of my heroes. How have they preached this text? Take some learnings, gleanings, and you're consciously imitating at that point. But there were unconscious imitations going on all the time, and it would sneak out. And I would realize, like, oh, that came from so and such, or that came from, and it's people you're reading, and I would think some of that's inevitable. But I realized I was kind of a mutt of all these strands of different influences, but I didn't quite know who I was in terms of communication. And so I would say one of the things that happened probably after 3 or 4 years of preaching is I found my voice. But it took a couple hundred sermons before I did. And just sort of knowing like this is what I'm good at in terms of communication. And I don't actually need to be anybody else.
Hmm.
Um, I can take good things from people, but I shouldn't be trying to be someone else.
It's kind of an awkward question, but what would you say are your kind of this is what I'm good at and this is where I feel weaker, strengths and weaknesses? Not that in a sense
Yeah.
it doesn't matter, but I think it's helpful for us to hear someone else thinking that through because then we can help think about
Yeah.
ourselves as well.
So, John Stott's Between Two Worlds. I love his like horizons, right? So you've got the horizon of the text, the ancient world, you've got the transcendent principles of like the bridge, and then you've got the contemporary world, and you do that double listening where you're trying to read the Bible in the newspaper and you're the translator, right? And I love that analogy. I think it serves in so many good ways. Um, I think when I first started, I was really good at the text. I got better at the bridge next. And then there was a wave where I was like really trying to do the cultural exegesis piece. And then I think I've come back a little bit and I'm more centered in the theology piece. I feel like there's a couple things maybe I do fairly well is I think I translate. Like I read commentaries and nobody wants to read a commentary, but I can translate things in ways that are helpful. So I view myself as a translator in many ways, bringing clarity and organization to a theme or a topic. there's a, I'm intuitive emotionally and like on a like soul level of like, how does the gospel actually shape me? And so that intuition, I think, comes out in a million little things. It's less academic and more heartfelt. And so that comes out. But I think there's also a sense in which I'm more intuitive of like where the average person's at culturally and what those influences are, and knowing I have to rewrite people's narratives because they're coming at the scriptures like from a totally different worldview, from a secular worldview. And so I have to actually help poke holes in their secular thinking, and then show how the gospel actually provides a better story and a better alternative, that's more meaningful and rich. And so I don't know, those are some of the things that I try to do. Anyway, I yeah, I think I'm expositional for sure. That's like my method is expositional, but there's a skill in terms of making that exposition alive, dynamic, not boring, and connecting to a soulful existence that says like I'm a deeply spiritual being, and how do I live in this world in a way that honors God and is bringing that gospel reality into my life. That's what I think I do. That's, if I'm adding value, I think it's in those areas. So
What would kind of push you? I don't know whether it's a certain Bible passage or a certain situation, or where would you suddenly feel like, well, this is my weak area?
mm.
Do you see what I mean? Like, because what you just described sounds all very positive and
Yeah. Yeah,
helpful.
I think the weak, so I love narrative. It's probably my strongest suit. I was trained really to do Paul well. I felt like
Okay.
in my academic preparation, like they taught us how to preach Paul, and then we didn't quite know what to do with other genres, you know? I've come to really love narrative. Like that's my favorite thing to preach. And if I have a weak suit, it's probably like the minor prophets. And I think it's or actually major prophets too, because it's just, it seems like it takes them forever to get to, you know, it's like, how do you cover Isaiah? Like you could get bogged down in there forever, you know? And so I would say that that's probably my weak suit, would be in that kind of literature. Um, and I haven't done a lot of apocalyptic.
What makes narrative, when you preach narrative well, what makes it work?
It's a great question. So I remember having a bit of an epiphany maybe 10 years ago when I realized that basically all of my Bible reading profs or whatever, like everything sort of like, it was like, get all the principles and the theology out of the text and then like put it into like systematic categories, you know, as if what God should have given us in the beginning was a systematic theology. Now, no one would say that, right? But it was sort of this
Some would.
idea. Yeah, it's like, but he didn't reveal himself in a systematic theology. He revealed himself in story and poetry and art and real life. Like, I'll live with you. I'll walk with you, Abraham. And over time, you're going to discover who I am as I, in bits and pieces, reveal my heart, my character to you. And you have to learn to adjust your living in light of what you're receiving and living in this dynamic relation. Like, and you start to, like, I had this moment, I realized like in the Old Testament, God, I think exclusively reveals himself in poetry. Like if you actually look at the forms of how he's speaking, it has a poetic cadence to it. And you go, why would that be? Why would God's primary categories be narrative and poetry? And then when Jesus shows up, it's parables, right? Why? Why is this? And so I actually think what I've discovered, I think human beings we're creatures who need story. We tell stories, we live in stories, we understand life through the lens of story. and God is actually giving us a story. And so we are meant to interpret life through the story that we're being told in the scriptures. And once you start to see that dynamic at play, this drama that's unfolding in scripture, to me, from a communication standpoint, you start to see the brilliance of it. And that's what God's primarily doing. And so then that makes me really enjoy the narrative, because I can see what he's doing in these stories. And so it allows me to just really enjoy them a lot more. And so where I started, which was much more propositional, has recentered into much more of a narratival approach. So I think of my sermons as like a story. I'm laying the foundations, I'm building the world, I'm creating a tension. I'm trying to develop that tension through purposeful interactions. I want to have a moment where everything, like, there's an aha, there's the French, the denouement, right? As everything, all the threads are coming together. And to me, that's always the gospel. It's the cross. It's the message of Christ. And so we're driving to that. And so, there's an arc to it. And so I don't know. So I really love narrative for that standpoint, because I can see Jesus doing the same things. And then the other thing I try to do, I'm not just trying to communicate the truth of whatever's going on in the narrative. I'm trying to take you on the journey of what's happening in the narrative.
Right.
So yeah. So if Jesus is moving you to a place of dissonance, like, my job rhetorically as a preacher is to create the same journey toward dissonance. And my job is not to relieve it. Like, if Jesus just leaves it hanging, then as a communicator, I need to leave it hanging in the same way. And that is, again, that wasn't my intuition early on, but now I see the brilliance of it. And sometimes it's like, you don't need to answer the question.
Right.
You just need to surface it, bring it to the tension point, and leave it, because that's what Jesus is doing. And that's what to use speech act language, that's what the speech act is actually accomplishing. And if you go, well, let's nuance this away, then you lose the power of it.
Yeah, totally. And what about with that insight, which you've sort of developed and gained, which I totally resonate with. I love narratives now as well. Do you now come to the sort of the discourse, the epistles, with what I think of as sort of a supra genre, like the narrative is the ultimate genre, really, and discourse and poetry are like snapshots into a narrative. So do you come to an epistle with a bit of narrative mindset or hermeneutic or
Yeah.
theology? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, because you have to ask, where is this in the story? And Paul's not just writing theology in abstract. He's writing theology for a purpose. So, like, Romans is a great example. He's going through, Jews and Gentiles alike are sinners. Their common salvation in Christ and the unification of what's happening between Jews and Gentiles. And the whole point is, accept one another as God in Christ Jesus has accepted you. So you need to live out your ecclesial unity, because you were united in sin, and you're united in salvation, and you're united in the body of Christ, and you have all the same problems and all the same blessings, and therefore you cannot live separate lives. You have to learn to live in harmony with one another, because what God has joined together, you can't. So that theological treatise is sitting in a story of what's going on in Rome and what needs to be accomplished pastorally in the lives of these people. And so you have one deep theological move that's happening, that's meant to propel people towards some resolution in the community. And if you lose sight of the bigger story, then we're just stringing together propositions, and we forget that it's theology with purpose and pastoral intent. And so yeah, and you could do that with any of these things, right? you look at Timothy, and it's, Paul's protege, and he's been left there in Ephesus. And so he's all by himself, and he's trying to
Right.
figure it out. And it's more than just, here's a letter. It's,
Right.
these are real people in real context trying to figure out how to live out the story that God's given them. So,
Yeah, I think that the Romans one's key because that's often separated out, isn't it, as a sort of, like you say, a theological treatise. I think it was Melanchthon that used that description of it, and it's sort of stuck. And so people say, well, this is just the gospel in abstract.
yeah, not to say that those doctrines are not beautiful and glorious and worth treasuring and viewing almost in abstract. They're wonderful, but they're not meant ultimately to be um, disembodied
Right.
from their larger intent and purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, the fact that God gives his theology, I suppose English phrase would be in concrete, but that's too hard. It's kind of in fleshed, isn't it? It's in the flesh of real life or real church or real person. I think, if for me it was a real gift when I studied when I was studying, I did my master's thesis on Romans, and it was looking at the context of the letter as a whole that kind of made me go, whoa, hang on a minute, this really isn't a theological treatise. It has incredible theological content, or credible, which is important. But it's the context, the occasion, of what's going on in Rome, what's going on in Paul's life, what's going on in that situation. And God is targeting through that a very applied presentation of the gospel. And if that's true of Romans, how much more is that going
Right.
to be true of, therefore of every letter, every speech? Nothing's done abstractly, everything's on purpose. So yeah, I think that's a really good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful. And I don't know if I reference speech act theory, but I find this very helpful. Speech act theory breaks every speech act. That speech is not just saying things, it's doing things. That's speech act theory. And there's three parts to it. The technical words don't matter, but there's the words themselves, there's the intent of the speaker in using those words, and then there's the way those words are received and responded to in the shared experience. So like a good example is, the meat's been on the counter for 3 hours, right? If my wife says the meat's been on the counter for 3 hours, well, it could mean a lot of things. Are we thawing the meat out? And it's been there 3 hours, which means it thawed enough that I'm ready to cook it. So she's saying, turn on the grill. The meat's been on the counter for 3 hours. Go turn on the grill. It also might mean that meat's been out too long. It needs to go in the fridge. Like maybe it's cured meat, right? Or beef jerky or something. And it just needs to be put away, but it hasn't gone bad. It could be that it was raw meat and it's been out for 3 hours and it needs to be thrown away. Like it's bad, right? So like the words themselves, the meat's been on the counter for 3 hours, like you can look at that phrase, but you need to know what's the intent behind it. And then you can watch what I do in response, because if I take it and throw it away, you know the meaning now. And so there's all kinds of examples of this in scripture that like, not only is Jesus saying something, but he's saying it with a purpose. He has intent behind that statement. And then the way it's being received helps you understand how that works. So the famous example is like when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And they pick up stones to stone him. And you say, well, before Abraham was, I am. What does that mean? He clearly is trying to say, I am the God of Israel, Yahweh himself, face to face. And the fact they pick up stones confirms that. So
Mhm.
you have the statement, you have the intent, and you have the response, and that it creates the interpretive environment. So for example, so how does this actually help you? Let's say the parable of, the workers that come into the field, and you've got the people that come in the early morning and they work all day and they get paid a certain amount, and the people that come 2 hours later get paid the same amount at the end of the day, and the people that come three, they're hired in shifts, and at the end, these chaps show up and they only work for like 2 hours and they get the same pay, right? So that story is creating something. It's not just a story. You're supposed to feel angst with the workers over the inequity of the payment. And this is where Jesus is so brilliant, because which worker you identify with changes the way you respond to the story. So if you think, man, I'm a real sinful, rotten person, and so I'm like the 3 o'clock hire, because there's no way I worked the whole day in the field. I didn't deserve the wages I'm getting in the gospel of grace. God's salvation he gives to me, I didn't deserve it. I'm the last guy who should have it. And so you say, I can't believe I got paid a full day's work. It's amazing. So if you mentally associate yourself with the guy later in the day, you walk away from that story and go, isn't God gracious? But if you're a Pharisee and you think, I'm one of the guys who got hired first, you walk away and go, how unfair is God that he would accept dirty, rotten sinners? And I've been slaving all these years for you, Father, and you never gave me a fatted calf. Okay, so you see, and so the Pharisees who identify with the early workers are walking away, and they're aggravated by the story. And the reality is, and this is the gospel, Jesus is the only one who worked a whole day's work. Everybody, including the Pharisees, were hired later. And so it doesn't matter, you know what I mean? We all get grace. And so the people in the middle of the day versus the late of the day, they should all be grateful, because Jesus is the only one who earned a day's wage in the gospel, right? But see, the power of that story lies in the brilliance of its telling, and Jesus leaves the nuances for you to figure out on purpose. And so as you preach this, so when I preach this, okay, I can't take away the brilliance of that rhetorical strategy. I have to find a way to preach that in a way that allows people to create those associations and then therefore feel the angst that Jesus intended. I can't take it away. So how do I do that? See that? So that's where speech act theory helps you start to go, okay, what's his intent? How is it supposed to affect me? It's not just the words of the parable that I'm preaching. I'm also trying to create the same tension, the same rhetorical effect, so that my audience today is experiencing the same moment of decisiveness when it comes to the clarity of the gospel that Jesus' original communication conveyed. And so that's my task. I'm doing more than preaching words. I'm trying to do all of that. And that's where it gets really fun for me, because there's no textbook for that. That gets really creative really fast as a communicator, and that's fun.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I totally agree. And there's lots of textbooks about it, but you still got to do it. It's
right.
no one's yet kind of, here's the definitive textbook. We used to ask Haddon Robinson all the time, have you ever thought about writing a book with all the big ideas of all the passages? And he's like, oh, there's only about 10 of them. Basically, there's 10 big ideas. They just weave their way through the Bible in different forms. And we're like, okay, can you give us the 10? Oh, yeah. And he'd start off and he'd give us 2 and we'd be scribbling down. Then he'd go, oh, never mind, and change subjects. It's like, oh, almost got the 10 out of him. But yeah, he said, honestly, if I gave you a book with my version of every big idea, think about how much you would have missed out on all the processing and all the work, which is exactly what you're describing.